There is a chance that COVID-19 was created in a lab, and then it leaked out and infected the world.
The Chinese city where the coronavirus pandemic is believed to have started.
They're very competent, trustworthy scientists.
Probably it was incompetent, somebody was stupid.
Whoa, did I just say that? Yes, I did. 6 months ago, I would not have been able to say that, but today I can. And we need to talk about it. Humans, including myself, hate uncertainty, ambiguity. We want to know what happened. But in the case of COVID-19, we still don't know exactly what happened. We don't know where it came from. And to try to get at the real answer, you have to navigate all sorts of politics. But wait, isn't this a science question? Isn't this a matter of epidemiology, the origin of a virus? It should be, but woven into this scientific question are a bunch of heavy political questions and considerations that are influencing what kind of questions we're allowed to ask and what kind of answers we're allowed to give. So I want to strip away the politics, the tension with China, the idea that this all sounds like one big conspiracy, and I want to just look at the evidence of one question, which is, where did COVID-19 come from?
The most trafficked wild animal in the world.
Wuhan also has China's only biosafety level 4 super laboratory.
China has a history of lab accidents.
Are you suggesting that maybe you have some evidence that this was not a naturally occurring virus?
So it's not just me who wants to know the answer to this. Last month, President Biden asked the US intelligence community to double down in answering this one question: where did COVID come from?
It's important to know the answer to that.
Right now, there are two major hypotheses. One is the spillover hypothesis, and the second one is the lab leak hypothesis, which has up until recently been seen as a fringe conspiracy theory.
Complete baloney.
And I'm going to explain why that changed in just a minute. But first, let's look at each of these. First, the spillover hypothesis.
Health officials believe COVID-19 originated in animals sold in a so-called wet market in China.
A pangolin kissed a turtle.
The spillover hypothesis says that the coronavirus came from bats in China, which is pretty predictable. Bats in China have tons of coronaviruses all the time. They're usually not infectious to humans. But the hypothesis says that a strain came about that was infectious to maybe an animal, maybe one of these guys, a pangolin. And then that animal showed up in some supply chain, some market in central China, and it came in contact with a human, and the human got COVID-19. And in fact, for a while, it was this particular market in Wuhan that was seen as the culprit. They thought the bat virus was in an animal somewhere in this market. And now listen, for a really long time, up until just recently, I didn't know this was a hypothesis. I thought this was a fact. Like in the early days of the pandemic, they would talk about this like it wasn't a question. They'd be like, and the virus that came from this meat market.
The virus originated from a market.
This meat market, ground zero for the outbreak.
But guess what? There's no direct evidence for this. They don't even have pangolins in the Wuhan wet market. And soon we learned that the first official COVID case had no contact with this market. So the Chinese CDC had to come out and say, okay, no, it actually has nothing to do with this market. We have no idea where this outbreak came from. But even after they said that the market wasn't the epicenter, the idea was still that this came from a bat that transferred it to an animal, that transferred it to a human, the spillover hypothesis. The main reason why this hypothesis gained so much traction was because this is how pandemics usually happen. Of the past 5 pandemics, 4 of them were the result of a virus jumping from an animal onto humans. So even though no one had found an animal with COVID-19 to prove this theory, they sort of presumed that it had to be because look at these other 4. But wait, what about this one? The Russian flu of 1977 was likely the result of a lab accident, and it ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people. But even still, the spillover hypothesis was kind of gospel. Hey, real quick, I'm gonna be doing a Q&A on Discord next week, a week from today, on Thursday. It's gonna be a live stage event, which is sort of like a personal chat with whoever wants to join. Discord, by the way, is the sponsor of today's video. Thank you, Discord. But anyway, this event is where you can join and ask me whatever questions you want, and I will be talking for an hour about storytelling and about my process and about the future of documentary things and Bright Trip and all of the things. I will be answering all of your questions in this sort of personal back and forth Discord live stage setting. Anyone can join, it's free. All you have to do is sign up for Discord, which is like a 15-second process. Sign up for Discord. There's a link in my description where you can register for this Q&A event, which is next week, Thursday at noon Eastern time, okay? So I'm going to put on the screen what time that is in other time zones around the world. Noon Eastern time on Thursday. I will be answering tons of questions on Discord as a live stage event. And I'm kind of excited to hear from all of you, to hear what questions you have, and to chat and catch up and see what people are thinking about. So thank you, Discord, for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. But quietly, there was another theory that was brewing under the surface, one that many experts didn't talk about publicly at the time, but they thought about. They were thinking of another building in Wuhan, not this market, but another building that was just a few miles down the road. This one right here, the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
So here's what's crazy. It's exactly in this specific lab in Wuhan where scientists have been experimenting for years with coronaviruses, engineering them to make them even more infectious to human beings.
More infectious to humans? Whoa. By the way, that's Paji. He's one of my producers. He reached out to me a while back and said that we should look into the alternative hypotheses of where COVID came from, including this idea that it may have leaked from this lab. At the time, I was quite skeptical. I had heard rumblings about the idea of a lab accident that caused COVID, and I'd sort of written it off because it just seemed so conspiracy, just like low-hanging fruit conspiracy, like super engineered virus escapes from lab and starts global pandemic. It's like New World Order. It just reeks of like internet conspiracy and disinformation. And in addition to that, the only people who were touting this were like people who are not very good at the truth, and people who also liked to pick fights with China.
I can tell you that there is a significant amount of evidence that this came from that laboratory in Wuhan.
But I told Paji that if there's any evidence, even circumstantial, that warrants looking further into this hypothesis, I would be interested in checking it out. And it turns out there was such evidence, and here it goes. So, this is the lab leak hypothesis, and I'm going to unpack it the best I can. First, let's talk about this lab. It's located in central China, the city of Wuhan, and for years, they have been experimenting on coronaviruses, what Paji was telling me about. The question is, why on earth would you want to make a coronavirus more infectious to humans?
So this is what's known as gain-of-function research, and the idea is to study more infectious versions of the virus in order to learn from that what we need in order to stop the next pandemic from ever happening in the first place.
Gain-of-function research. This is sort of like testing nuclear weapons. You're sort of playing with fire, testing something that has the power to kill millions of people, but you're doing so in the name of like helping humanity. There are only 3 places on Earth that do this sort of risky research, and it's supposed to be done in these super high security, biosecure facilities that have all these parameters to make sure that the engineered virus doesn't escape. And by the way, in the scientific community, many people think this is too risky and not worth it. One critique I read from a scientific journal said that, quote, if the virus escapes, nobody could predict the trajectory. We're messing with genetics, and that's scary. Okay, but just remember for a second that all of this gain-of-function research is happening in like 2015 through 2018. Just rewind for a second. None of us had heard the word coronavirus before. This was effectively some boring, wonky, nerdy debate happening between super niche scientists who were studying the best way to look at viruses. And all the while, as they did this work studying all of these coronaviruses from bats, the freezers in this lab in Wuhan started filling up with more and more samples of coronaviruses of all kinds. Some just captured from bats in caves, and others engineered to be more infectious to humans. But again, no one really cared. If I had made a video about this work in 2017, you wouldn't have watched it. But in 2017, there was someone who did care. It was someone at the US Embassy in Beijing. They caught wind that in this Wuhan lab, they were curating coronaviruses and engineering more infectious ones. This wasn't some secret. This was like in collaboration with scientists in the US and around the world. But even still, they sent a team of health experts to check out the lab. And what they saw troubled them. The lab wasn't nearly as safe as it needed to be. And the managers at the lab said that they were lobbying for more resources so that they could hire properly trained technicians to safely run the lab. The diplomats were concerned and they sent 2 messages back to Washington, D.C. at 2 different periods of time. They said this lab isn't safe and the State Department should work with the Chinese to tighten security. These 2 cables went back to Washington, D.C. and both were ignored. Again, this was like super boring stuff in 2017 and 2018. No one had heard of Anthony Fauci. This wasn't top priority. So it was ignored until 2020, when suddenly we all care about virology.
Concerns about the deadly coronavirus officially hitting the U.S. 2, 3, all the way.
Okay, so you have this lab that's doing gain-of-function research. They're maybe not very secure. Now it's 2020, and I need to explain something that was hard for me to understand at first, but it's very important. Any hypothesis as to the origins of COVID has to take into account the fact that this new deadly coronavirus called COVID-19 broke out in the very city where the largest repository of coronavirus samples sit in a freezer in this lab, some of which have been engineered to become more infectious to humans. Oh, and the lab has been deemed not super safe. If the outbreak had happened in some other city where there was no lab with a freezer full of coronaviruses, we would not be having this conversation. This would not even be on the table. But Wuhan is the epicenter of coronavirus samples on Earth because of this lab.
Oh my God! There's been an outbreak of chocolatey goodness near Hershey, Pennsylvania. What do you think happened? Like, oh, I don't know. Maybe a steam shovel mated with a cocoa bean. Or it's the chocolate factory.
Okay, wait, hold on. I know some of you were thinking this. I was thinking this. At first, I thought this was a logical fallacy. Originally, I had said, well, of course, it's not a coincidence that there's a coronavirus lab in the same city that there was an outbreak. The lab was probably set up because there's a lot of risk of coronaviruses, so they set up the lab to study it so that they could prevent it. But then I read an interview with one of the top researchers at the Wuhan lab, one of the biggest experts in bats and coronaviruses, and this changed my mind. Her name is Shi Zhengli, but her nickname is the Batwoman.
You're about to become compost.
Because she's made her career out of going into caves, getting coronavirus samples from bats so that she can study them. She's like a top expert on this stuff, and she works in the Wuhan lab. When she heard that there was a coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, she was in Shanghai at a conference. So she got on a train to rush back to Wuhan. So she's on this train, and later she said in an interview, quote, I wondered if the local health authorities got it wrong by calling it the coronavirus. She's like, something's off here. Wuhan is in central China. And from the Batwoman's extensive study into this, she knows that it's actually southern China where all the bats are and where coronavirus is most likely to jump from animals to humans. Way down here in southern China, that's where COVID-19's cousin SARS broke out in the early 2000s. That's the place where there is an actual major risk of coronavirus jumping from animals. So the Batwoman is on this train, shaking her head. She literally said in the interview, quote, I had never expected this kind of thing to happen in Wuhan, in central China. This is a thing that happens in